America, this is your heritage.
A nation which does not remember what it was yesterday does not know what it is today, nor what it is trying to do. We are trying to do a futile thing if we don't know where we have come from or what we have been about.
This is true with America today. We have forgotten where we've come from and what we've been about, and this is especially true when it comes to the role of the church, of ministers and Christians in the civil arena. Strident voices both inside and outside the Christian community assert that Christians never have been involved in the civil arena and shouldn't be now. Many Christians have even embraced this constricting mentality, and they've adopted a compartmentalized view that allows them to express faith and values in church, but segregates those same faith and values from the civil arena. Yet the teachings of the Bible reject this compartmentalized approach to life, and our history proves that for generations, Christians embrace the proper viewpoint. Today, we have an opportunity few others in our history have had, an opportunity to dramatically improve our culture and to be salt and light in a number of strategic areas in the public square. Yet the church will miss this opportunity, and we will fail future generations unless we change our thinking and our actions. To do this, we must first understand the true historical and biblical role of Christians in the civil arena. American history, or better said, our view of American history, has a substantial impact on our behavior today. U.S. Supreme Court's a great example. Every time you go into the U.S. Supreme Court, you're arguing about a document that's 200 years old. You're arguing about the Constitution. And so one side says, well, here's what that clause means. Another side says, no, here's the history of that clause. And so the way we view our history, even on our American documents, affects the way we live today. So history is something substantial. I think that's a big reason that there is such a huge emphasis on history in the Bible. God gives us verse after verse that tells us to recall the former days, remember the former times, to know our history. You find that even revivals that are associated in the Scriptures deal with rediscovering history, as it was with Josiah. They found that old scroll in the temple, they brought it out, they read it, and they said, you mean we used to be like this? Led to a national revival. The whole thing that saved the nation with Esther was Mordecai was about to be hung. The king read the history book. He said, I forgot that happened. And it turned the gallows of Haman from Mordecai to actually hanging Haman. Right. So history's a huge thing as far as current modern behavior. It's based on who we were as a people. An excellent indication of how much Americans have forgotten their own history occurs around the 4th of July. If you ask most citizens on that day why we separated from Great Britain, the overwhelming response will be taxation without representation. That answer's okay as far as it goes. Taxation without representation was one of the grievances listed in the Declaration, but it was only one of 27 reasons given. Actually, taxation without representation was one of the lesser reasons listed alongside Great Britain's suppression of immigration and her interference with our foreign trade. Listed in the Declaration 11 times more often than taxation without representation was the abuse of representative powers. The abuse of military powers was listed 7 times as often. The abuse of judicial powers 4 times as often, and generally stirring up domestic insurrection twice as often. In fact, taxation without representation was only grievance number 17 out of the 27. It was given little emphasis in the Declaration, yet it is the one issue that everyone knows about today. We started changing at least the way we deal with American history in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. We went from a very substantial view of having God involved in American history to a very secular view of American history. We look back in the early textbooks in the 1700s, 1800s. This is one of the most popular textbooks in American history. It was from 1878. This was used in public schools for generations, and the author of that textbook, Charles Coffin, calls the story of liberty. He says, if you do not see the divine hand working behind the scenes with what's going on in history, history will be an incomprehensible enigma. And that's what it's become for American students. We've taken God's hand out of history. No longer does anything have meaning. It's just a series of dates and places and events. There's not a purpose to history. It's an incomprehensible enigma. Very few really like history today as it's taught. But we used to teach history in a very different way. In the 1920s and 30s and 40s, we had a whole new group of historical writers that appeared on the scene. Charles and Mary Beard, W.E. Woodward, Fairfax Downey, and they started saying, you know, the only thing that really motivates people is money. That's all that anybody cares about. Let's teach history that way.
Wow.
So they started writing a whole series of textbooks that were what were called the economic view of history. The economic view of the Declaration, the economic view of the Constitution, the economic view of the American people, everything was economics. Well, the problem with that is when you apply that paradigm to American history, and we did that officially in the 1960s, textbook writers adopted what's called the economic view of American history. The result is now of 40, 60, 70 years of being taught economic view. When you study the Declaration of Independence today, we learn that America was founded. The reason they did the Declaration of Independence was because of taxation without representation.
Right.
Well, that's an economic reason. The problem with that is the Declaration gave 27 different reasons that we became an independent nation. Now, taxation without representation was number 17 of the 27. It wasn't even their top list. It wasn't that substantial. I mean, it was an issue. It was definitely an issue, but it was not the issue. It was in the bottom half of their list on why they separated from Great Britain. So under this economic view of American history that we've had for 70 years, it affects the way we see government. It affects what we think government should be about, what government's supposed to be about jobs and stopping the outsourcing and economics. And no, any given session of Congress deals with between 10 and 13,000 bills a session. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those bills have nothing to do with economics, but we'll never hear that on the news.
Wow.
And that's the problem we have with American history. We've taught that history deals only with economics. It's all government's about. And it's all we see anymore. So we've lost so much of the moral and the religious foundations.
Are you telling me that that worldview came in the 20s, 30s with the writers that you described? And what was their point there? Was their point to disengage America from its faith of the founding fathers? What do you think the point was in that slew of different writers?
What you find is that in those writers that reintroduced this new way to teach history, they were themselves very secular. People like Robert Ingersoll was the first great well-known atheist in America, and he started advocating that American government has been secular from the very inception. The Declaration of Independence is a secular document. Now, that's nonsense, because if you read the Declaration, it acknowledges God 4 times, but he says, oh no, it's a secular document. So starting in 1876, you had a group that was historically called the American Liberal Union. Their whole purpose, they have a platform, a political platform, was to remove God from public affairs, to remove God out of public knowledge, to remove God out of textbooks. That was their platform. Well, a lot of the guys that were writing textbooks, that were historians, were part of that movement, that secular movement. So as they come into the 1920s, their thing is, we don't care about God's hand in history. Now, you go back to our view of history that we've had, which is what's often called a providential view of American history. That's what every major historian taught.
Right.
George Bancroft, called the father of American history. I mean, he taught that God's providence in history is as important in history as the events that happen. Where was God trying to take history?
Wow.
Daniel Webster has a great quote. He says, history is God's providence in human affairs. And that's his definition of history. So we did not flinch from talking about the fact that when we signed the Declaration of Independence, a lot of the signers signed the Declaration because they said they were pursuing religious liberty. The king would not allow them to have Bible societies. He vetoed their missionary societies. He demanded an established church. They didn't get to pick where they want. And founders said, that's why we're separating.
Let me make sure I understand what you're trying to say. Basically, American history was accounted for correctly for about 100 years.
Actually, longer than that, because you take the first histories we have in America, they start back in the 1630s of Plymouth Plantation. And from 1630 till about 1900, about 270 years, we just told history the way it happened, which meant there was a lot of religious and moral and governmental aspects that were not economic.
Right.
So 270 years, we taught a full scope of American history. We started about 1900 moving away from that. 1920s, we started teaching a very secular view, and since the 1960s, we've only taught an economic view of history. And that cuts out 95% of what happens in history.
Great historians understand that how we view our history determines the decisions we make in the present and ultimately decides the course of our future. But what happens when we forget the truths of our history? And what are the consequences when we do? Rediscover the astonishing story of our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
that back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, a new group of historical writers began writing textbooks in America. They included Charles and Mary Beard, W.E. Woodward, Fairfax Downey, and many other writers. Apparently believing that the only thing that mattered in life was money, they began to teach American history with that emphasis, and they introduced what is now called the economic approach to American history, authoring books like this, The Economic Basis of Politics. They also presented the economic basis of the Constitution, the economic basis of the Revolution, and in other words, economics was the basis. And since the economic clause in the Declaration was taxation without representation, this is the one clause we've learned about in our history books for the past half-century. And now, after 2 generations of having been taught that economics is the only thing that matters, our behavior seems to conform to that teaching. For example, 45% of evangelical Christians who voted in recent elections said that economic issues were more important than moral issues. And now we even judge our national leaders not on the basis of their moral character or other leadership traits, but rather on the basis of how the economy is doing, what the unemployment rate is, or how the Dow Jones Industrial Average is performing. Yet if you read American history textbooks prior to these recent writers, in fact, if you just read the 27 reasons given in the Declaration for why we've separated, you'll find a completely different view of history from that which is taught today. You'll find that issues other than economics motivated most individuals.
You mentioned that there was 27 separate reasons that the signers basically wanted the Constitution. What are some of the top 3 if 17 was, basically taxation without representation?
What we don't get is that you have 11 of those clauses deal with abuse of governmental powers. Right. So they were really against, and it was abuse of representative powers. You had the government, the British government coming in, our legislatures would pass laws, and the British government say, oh, we don't want that. Great example was we passed a number of anti-slavery laws as British colonies. The British government vetoed every one of them. We passed a number of religious liberty laws. The British government vetoed them. So we called that an abuse of representative powers. We believed in the consent of the governed. We believed in the will of the majority, and Great Britain kept setting that aside. We had 7 clauses that dealt with military abuses. One of the problems we had is that the military was not run by civilians, it was run by military independent of civilians. So in America, our commander-in-chief is a civilian. We make sure that the civilians are over the military. Yet there are 4 clauses in the Declaration that deal with judicial abuses. The founders said, hey, we're tired of being part of a government where the judges make policy. We're going to start our own nation where judges don't make policy. We never hear that judicial activism was an issue in the Declaration of Independence. You also have moral issues. 2 clauses deal with King George won't let us end slavery. We want to end slavery. We're going to start our own nation where we can end slavery. Religious liberties was another big issue in the Declaration. But all we hear is taxation without representation. This is from 1762. And it is the charter for the very first missionary society in America, the society to propagate the gospel among Indians and others in North America. America thought it was a great idea, but King George III apparently thought that it would compete with the work of the nationally established church, so he vetoed the charter. This type of action by the king did not sit well with a number of the founders who wanted religious liberty in America, including the ability to start missionary societies, Bible societies, or Sunday school societies. Consequently, founding fathers like Charles Carroll of Carrollton and Samuel Adams, who became signers of the Declaration, said that religious freedom was the reason they became involved in the American Revolution. And then there was the issue of slavery. In 1774, Pennsylvania had passed a law abolishing slavery, and other colonies were also making attempts to end slavery, but King George III vetoed those American anti-slavery laws. The king was pro-slavery, the British Empire practiced slavery, and as long as we were part of the British Empire, we would also practice slavery. This position by the king was a source of great discontent for many founders. Henry Lawrence, a president of Congress during the American Revolution, protested against this British position. Lawrence proclaimed,
I abhor slavery, but I was born in a country where slavery had been established by British kings and parliaments ages before my existence.
Since the only way for America to end slavery was to separate from Great Britain, many founders decided that separation would be an appropriate course of action. In fact, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he personally penned the clause declaring,
King George III has waged cruel war against human nature itself. violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce.
That is, not only has King George III engaged in slavery in the slave trade, but he has even opposed all efforts to stop it. Ending slavery was so important to so many of the founders that when America did separate from Great Britain in 1776, several states began to abolish slavery, including Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and others.
So somebody along the line just decided that America should really remember its past and remember its history through the almighty dollar.
Right.
Is basically what happened.
Because that was all that was of importance to those writers. Those particular writers, all they cared, they didn't care about God, they didn't care about religion, morality. What they cared about was economics and gain. And so that's what they cared about, that's what they wrote about. And you'll find that with most writers, they write about the things they care about.
Right.
Well, what happened was we allowed them to be really the writers of textbooks for a number of decades. And so what happens in historical circles is you start repeating what other historians are saying.
Right.
And you pick up their paradigm, and that becomes what the whole universe of historians in that field say, and you forget what your history was. And that's really what they did.
Why do you think they chose the economic? Was that really a prevalent thing, and that changed the way that we actually can, our children's reading of history is affected by someone's choice that history should be viewed through the dollar?
Absolutely. It has affected that. It still affects that today. If you look at textbooks today, we still teach economic issues as the basis of what happens. For example, when we teach the colonization and the first colonists that came to America in the Virginia colony, if you will look at current textbooks right now, they say that the Virginia colony was founded to search for gold. Well, if you read the charter of the Virginia colony, that is listed down there about issue 22 or 24 or 26. Way up top was the propagation of the gospel. But since we're going to talk about the economic view, we're going to take this issue way down here in the 20s and elevate it to the #1 issue.
Wow.
And so when you look at the colonization aspects that we have in America today, we say that all the colonists came here looking for land, looking for wealth, looking to get away from economic poverty they had in Great Britain or France or Holland or wherever. That's nonsense. Every single charter for American colonization puts the propagation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's a huge thing, but you'll never hear that in a textbook today. That's why it's so important to go back and look at the original documents and not somebody's spin on the original documents. And that's what textbooks do, is spin that writer's view.
Great historians understand that how we view our history determines the decisions we make in the present and ultimately decides the course of our future. But what happens when we forget the truths of our history? And what are the consequences when we do? Rediscover the astonishing story of our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Not every state immediately abolished slavery. And it's also true that even though the overwhelming majority of founding fathers were anti-slavery, not all were. In fact, Jefferson's forceful denunciation of the slave trade in the original draft of the Declaration was complained about so strenuously by the delegates from Georgia and South Carolina that his clause was removed from the Declaration and a milder condemnation inserted. Nevertheless, the desire to end slavery was a major factor in the thinking of many founding fathers. In fact, this document is the Constitution of America's very first anti-slavery society, and the society was founded by Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Benjamin Rush, both of whom became signers of the Declaration of Independence. And the date on this Constitution is 1774. This society was founded 2 years before we separated from Great Britain. This was an act of civil disobedience. For King George III had said we could not end slavery, but these two founders ignored that fact and worked to end slavery anyway. In fact, Dr. Benjamin Rush led the anti-slavery fight for almost 4 decades and even headed the national abolition movement. For many founders, their desire to end slavery was religiously motivated. Consider, for example, this speech by John Quincy Adams. He so hated slavery and so crusaded against it that he was nicknamed the great hellhound of slavery for his unrelenting efforts to abolish that evil. In this speech, Adams cites the Bible passage from Luke 4, where Jesus declared that he had come to set at liberty the captives. John Quincy Adams then notes that if this was the goal of the Savior, it should also be the goal of all Christians. They too should work to end slavery. As you can see, issues such as religious liberties and the end of slavery, and a number of other issues, like the removal of trial by jury, the impressment of American seamen by the British, and the placing of the military power above the civilian power, these were important reasons behind the founders' separation from Great Britain. Yet all we hear about today is taxation without representation.
Just reminds me of that scripture that James says, where do wars and strife come from? It comes from the lust and the greed of your own flesh.
Wow.
I mean, look at what we are now living in because of that.
Well, we've had this for 70 years. It affects the way people behave.
Sure.
It affects, for example, Christians. They often call Christian voters the values voters.
Mm-hmm.
Those values voters, in polling, you look at different groups of Christian voters. They have Christian voters, born-again voters, evangelical voters. Evangelical voters are those who take their faith most seriously. They're the ones who live by the Scriptures, or at least say they do in polling. And yet, in the last several federal elections, you find that 45% of evangelicals said that when it came time to vote, economic issues are more important than moral issues. Now, that's not living your faith, but that's what you've been taught for 70 years.
Right.
You don't even recognize the influence that it has.
Okay,
and that's a problem.
What you just said was really important. Talking about the moral and the economic, because there's a whole group of evangelicals that do that.
That's right.
What gives me more? You know, what about my financial problems?
Well, and see, this affects even the way we analyze news.
Yeah.
Because in recent presidential debates, we've been televising presidential debates since Nixon. And so as you look at recent presidential debates, the last several presidents have had the issue of marriage come up in their debates. It's interesting that in the most recent presidential debates, in the last debate, the word jobs was mentioned 157 times. The word marriage was mentioned once.
Oh,
that didn't stand out to anybody. Nobody knows that because they're supposed to talk about jobs. They're supposed to talk about, well, marriage is a substantial issue.
Yes.
We've seen that in state after state. We've seen it in family after family. It's major to every major religion in America, but it's not talked about, but we don't notice that because we've been taught the economic view of American history.
Dave, I think that if I'm going to take away something from our conversation today is that somewhere along the line, you're talking about mainly the late 1800s, early 1900s, ultimately then in about 1960, the way that we view our history was completely changed by a set of textbook writers that chose to view history through the almighty dollar.
Let me give you a visual of this, because this is really good. Take someone like Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to America in the 1830s. America grew so fast, we got into what was called American exceptionalism. Around the world, people looked at America and said, how'd you do that? I mean, you've only had one revolution, and it's been decades. We've gone through a bunch in France and a bunch in Poland, etc. So people came to America as foreigners to see what made us different. Alexis de Tocqueville did that 1831 to 1834. He went back to France and wrote his findings for the French, said, here's what makes America different. Now, he did that in this book right here. This is the book that he did for Frenchmen. It's translated into English, and it also went across America, because here's a Frenchman saying, here's what makes America substantially different. And he goes through, he talks about our faith, he talks about our religion, he talks about that the chief political force in America is Christianity. He talks about you can't go through a town without finding Christian missions. He says they're the ones that take care of the poor, they're the ones, and he goes all through Christianity. Now, this is what we taught in colleges for the next 100 years. We arrive at today. We still teach Alexis de Tocqueville in colleges, but this is the version we use today. Now, I think there's something missing between those two versions.
Wow.
And if you look at this version specifically says in the front that this has been abridged for the modern reader.
Wow.
Well, what is it the modern reader needs here that we didn't have here?
Wow.
The answer is, you read this, they've taken all the religious and moral aspects out. All you have is just a recitation of the governmental aspects, the regulatory aspects, nothing on the faith of America, nothing on the morality of America. See, that's the difference between old historians and modern historians, is they cut out that, and that's how much of American history we've lost in this transition of historical textbooks.
Wow. So, the way we view history is very important.
It is. If we think that government is only about economics, and that's all history is about, that's what we're going to demand from government.
Yeah.
But if we go back and read the Declaration and say, no, government's also supposed to deal with moral issues, religious liberty issues, it's supposed to keep judges under control, it's supposed to make sure that the military doesn't get out. If we know our history that way, then that's what we expect in policies today. So what we know of history affects the way we behave right now today. You don't want to trust someone just because they write a book. Go back and check their sources. Go back and see what they wrote about. There's a number of books out now that deal with the founding era. The founding era was from 1760 through 1805. You check the bibliography, all their textbooks are written in the 1960s. Now, why would you study the 1760s out of 1960s books? Go back to the 1760s.
Yeah.
And that's what you look for in textbooks, is that reliance on original documentation.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us